background on myself, so you guys know where I'm coming from on this stuff. So I've been running the citywide ADU tour since 2013. This is our 8th tour. I built an ADU in 2010, started teaching a class for homeowners, started teaching classes for professionals in 2015 with Earth Advantage, which is a nonprofit organization based here in Portland, does green building work. And then I wrote a book in 2018 about ADUs, run an ADU specialist designation for practitioners, designers, builders, lenders, appraisers, run ADU Academy, which is like a day-long workshop in different locations around the West Coast primarily, which is where ADUs are a big phenomena. And built a few ADUs now, lived in them, rent them out. And then I've also done a lot of work with tiny homes on wheels, and so I'm a big fan of them as well. We'll be talking about those, and you'll see those on the tour tomorrow, and that is now becoming a more common part of the conversation in this market for very specific reasons. We'll be talking about that too. So that's a rundown of me and what this talk is going to cover. We're not going to be able to cover a lot of things. For example, normally I would spend some time talking about how to finance ADUs, how to pay for them, how are they appraised, what are the best architectural practices for design, and I'm not going to go into all that stuff necessarily, but I can speak to a lot of those things, so if you have particular questions that you want to ask, feel free to ask them maybe toward the end. But we're going to get through a lot of material in the next hour and a half, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. And if the questions that you're going to ask or if the questions you ask are going to be things I'll cover, I'll just say, we'll get to that shortly. All right, so who here is from outside of the city of Portland? Raise your hand. Meaning you currently live outside the city of Portland. Okay, so 20%? Cool. Who here is from outside of the state of Oregon? Please raise your hand. Okay, so 6, 7 people. Okay. Who here is outside of Oregon and Washington? Please raise your hand. Cool. So we got Northwest. So that's good. Oregon and Washington both now have incredibly good ADU codes. So I think I can speak, as though you live in a place with excellent codes, and we don't have to pander to the people who have terrible codes, which is most of the United States, frankly. If you're not from the West Coast, you unfortunately have terrible ADU codes. Because that's just how it is. Right now it's Oregon, California, and Washington for the most part. And even Washington doesn't yet have good ADU codes, but they will starting this coming winter, because they passed statewide reform. So the tour is tomorrow, 10 to 4. I'll be talking more about that. Today is this workshop. We also did the private guided tour. This tour is conducted by me, in partnership with Earth Advantage, Metro, the City of Portland, Energy Trust of Oregon. All the information about it is on accessorydwellings.org. The purpose of the tour is to help homeowners or any individuals who want to build an ADU to kind of accelerate their path to doing so by helping you get exposed to a bunch of different architectural styles of ADUs, different types of ADUs, to meet the homeowners who've just been through the process, so you can meet people who are just like you, who've gone through the process, and you can see that you can do this too. And then to meet the practitioners, the builders and designers who have done that, so you can connect with them, make those connections, grab their business cards. They want to get leads. You need those connections to get these projects done. And so this tour is really effective at doing that. The tour tomorrow is 10 to 4. The purpose is to basically, hasten the process of learning about all this stuff. If you are a auditory, or if you're a book learner, I have a book at the back of the room. You're welcome to pick that up tonight. It's very exhaustive. Goes through the whole process of designing and building an ADU. And the second half is about the policy of ADU development. If you want a deeper course, we offer courses through Earth Advantage that are 4 hours long. I have an 8-hour-long online class. There's a lot of resources here. And by the end of the day tomorrow, if you've been through this talk, if you've been on the tour, you're going to know a heck of a lot more than most people about ADU development. but there's a lot to it. So the tour has 14 site locations tomorrow. They're enumerated geographically. They start in the upper in North Portland, go down to southeast in Woodstock. End to end is 21 miles. There's bike racks at each location. If you can bike, you should, although it's going to be pretty hot in the afternoon. It'll be nice in the morning, so consider biking. If you cannot bike to all of them, you could bike through most of them in a lot less than 21 miles, or you can be really selective about which ones you go to. You don't necessarily have to try to hit them all. Maybe be selective based on what you see online, or what you learned tonight, or what floats your boat in terms of what you're interested in. There's a good variety to look at, and yeah, so it will take you all day to visit all of them if you're going at like a fast pace. So again, like I would say 2 per hour is a reasonable pace with drive time in between them. It just takes a while. So there's a bunch of different filtering mechanisms that you can use to look at how the ADUs are, look at different elements of the ADUs, but depending on your interests, you might say, I'm only interested in conversions of existing structures, like a garage conversion, basement conversion, therefore, I just want to visit, number 5, 8, 11, 13. This is on the website as well. Maybe you're just interested in accessible ADUs, then you just go to those ones that are marked accessible. Maybe you're interested in just like the innovative planning and zoning types of ADUs. And those are the ones on the right, number 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 10, 14. So I'm going to give you a quick summary of each of these right now, and then we'll go into more depth about them. Who here is somebody who, raise your hand if you have built an ADU on your property. So like 5 or so people. Raise your hand if you aspire to build an ADU on your property in the next couple years. Cool. Raise your hand if you're here for more practitioner or policy reasons, work reasons. Cool. 10 people. Great. Okay, so this is a pretty standard detached ADU. Number 1, 500 and something square feet, I believe, new construction. This is a tiny house on wheels. This is also the registration site. You guys do not have to register, however, because you are here, so you've already picked up your ADU tour booklet. You picked up your wristband. The wristband is your ticket for the tour, so you don't need to come to this site first. I would recommend not coming to this site first because it's going to be pretty busy from 9 to 11 a.m. But if it's convenient for you to come there, please do. But it will be better if you come 11 a.m., 12 p.m. or later, just because it's small and there won't be. It'll only be 2 or 3 people who can fit in there at a time, because it's a tiny house on wheels, pretty small. But I'll talk more about tiny homes on wheels momentarily. This is site number 3, cottage cluster. This is not ADUs. There's nothing about this that is ADUs except that, the concept of a cottage cluster is kind of alludes to the notion that it might be an ADU-like thing. It's a bunch of cottages. However, cottages are not subject to ADU rules, and these are not things that the average homeowner could ever conceive of doing, in large part because they are so expensive to execute. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But this is a new allowance that anybody who has a property in Portland can do now legally, so it's pretty interesting to learn about this option on residential properties. Stacked ADUs. Number 4 is a stacked ADU, which is to say it's 2 ADUs in one, so it's a 2 for 1. So there's actually not 14 sites. It's actually, there's 14 sites, but several of them have more than one ADU. This is a property with 2 ADUs. This is an ADU above a garage, number 5. Number 6 is also a tiny house on wheels. In this case, it's an aging family member who's living in the tiny house on wheels. And I'm kind of colloquially saying this is kind of the new ADU culturally in Portland, in that a lot of people are building ADUs for family members, and they're trying to do it as inexpensively as possible. And to be honest, tiny house on wheels are way less expensive than ADUs, so this is kind of becoming a new form of ADU in the sense that it's taking the place that the role that ADUs were playing culturally in Portland 10 years ago, when ADUs were $150,000, which they are not anymore. This is a prefab ADU. This is built by Wolf Industries. which is the lowest cost ADU available in the US at this point, as far as I know. We visited this factory today. It's a pretty impressive operation. They're turning out ADUs once every 12 days. What was it? 12 days. 12 business days. I mean, so they've built like 500 ADUs. They're now the most prolific ADU builder in Portland because they're coming in like on time, on budget. But as you will see when you visit their site tomorrow, it's not the most glamorous of all the ADUs for sure. So there's certainly a concession that you make if you do choose to go with this particular option. This is a garage conversion ADU, number 8. Number 9 is a interesting ADU. It's a detached ADU alongside a duplex. So it used to be that you could only build an ADU alongside a single family house. Now the Portland Code opened up and said you can build an ADU alongside of a duplex, so this family did that. Furthermore, they condoized this ADU such that they could essentially sell off each individual one of the duplex units plus the ADU to families and friends. And they live on the property next door, and they have a shared yard in their backyard of their single family house. So they have like a 4-unit compound that they're using as a, they're taking an expensive property and basically creating market rate, lower cost housing units for family and friends. So it's a really innovative use of both code and law and financing to create this kind of idealistic compound in the middle of the city. So I would definitely encourage people to check this one out. Number 10 is a beautiful 800 square foot ADU overlooking a bluff. It's pretty high-end looking, and it's actually, there's 2 ADUs on this property. The other reason to visit this property if you're interested in 2 ADUs is not that the basement ADU isn't on the tour, unfortunately, but the site layout is really cool. It's really tactically done. There's a lot of hardscaping. They've created outdoor courtyards for each and every unit and storage for each and every unit outside. So it's just a really interesting, inspiring site design on top of the ADU itself. This is a garage conversion ADU. Number 11, we'll be talking more about conversion options later today. This is an 800 square foot, 1-story ADU, which is pretty rare. You can't do this on most properties because most properties don't have sufficient square footage, but this property is like 20,000 square feet or 15,000 square feet, so they can fit in a 1-story, 800 square foot ADU. Cost-wise, it's comparable to doing a 2-story ADU. That's 800 square feet, but a 1-story ADU does afford you the ability to make an accessible ADU for one thing, and in some ways the floor plan can be nicer. If it's a 1-story structure, it can feel bigger. So this is a good example of just a rental unit with two bedrooms and a nice sized great room on 1 story. This is another garage conversion ADU. In this case, this was a homeowner DIY build. So whereas the other garage conversion was done by a professional, this is done by a homeowner. Therefore, he did it for really inexpensive, but it took forever, right? So that's a trade-off between hiring a professional and doing it yourself. This is the last ADU. It's a stacked ADU, and this is like a very high-end stacked ADU. And stacked ADUs are something that you couldn't do as of 2 years ago. They started allowing them 2 years ago, and now all of a sudden we're starting to see them. These are kind of on the cusp of being like unattainable for homeowners in that they cost quite a bit. And we'll talk more about cost, but this has a great return on investment if you can afford to do it, but it's not inexpensive to do. Okay, so we've talked about the overview of the ADUs that are on the tour and the purpose. Before we get into costs, which is kind of the #1 thing I've learned from teaching classes and running this tour that people really want to know about, so we're going to spend a lot of time analyzing the costs of the ADUs we're going to see on the tour. Before I get into that, any questions about anything so far? All right, and you can step up to the mic and just flick the little switch on the bottom to turn on the volume. It's on the under right down here. There you go.
What is stacked?
Stacked. What is stacked? Okay, so yeah, we'll talk more about that. But basically, you can do 2 ADUs on a property now, and so by stacked ADU, that's just a colloquial term I'm using to say 1 ADU on top of another. So they're in 1 structural envelope with 2 floors. Alternatively, you could theoretically do a side-by-side ADU, right? That's two ADUs sharing a wall, just like a stacked ADU does. Why would you not want to do a side-by-side? What's one reason? Space. So it might take up the same amount of square footage, but a stacked ADU, a staircase, if you're going to put a staircase in each one, that's one of the more expensive components of building. So it also takes up a lot of space. And it's like 2 units that have stairs, whereas if you do a stacked ADU, you only get 1 unit that has stairs. Why would you want to do a side-by-side versus a stacked ADU, alternatively? Well, I guess if you did 2 one-story ADUs, they would be accessible potentially, yeah. Okay. Sound transfer is going to be harder to do up-down than side-by-side. That's one reason. But generally, stacked ADUs are going to be a little bit better performance, a little bit better return on investment than side-by-side. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Reason that there aren't any basement ADUs.
Yeah. Make sure. Let's get that thing on. There's a button on the very bottom.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Just a switch.
Is there a reason basement ADUs aren't highlighted in this tour?
Oh, yeah. No, I wish there were basement ADUs on the tour. There's just not. And for whatever reason, I've had a hard time getting basement ADUs on the tour, but they do represent like 25% of the ADUs that are being built. So it's just an unfortunate outcome. But in this case, there's more than average garage conversion ADUs on the tour. And there's other types of things that haven't been on previous tours. So every tour is different. I never had the same ADU on any given tour, so it's always new ADUs for everybody to see. A lot of people have been to every ADU tour, and so by now, if they've been to every one, they've seen like 100 different ADUs. And, so that's just what we got this year. All right. Okay. So cost. So starting off with new construction. Right, so when I say new construction, I'm talking about detached new construction. This is kind of the most common style of ADU. It's 50% of the ADU stock. In Portland, it's just like a single detached ADU. And setting aside any disbelief you might have, like everybody who's building an ADU wants to do it as affordably as possible. They are all trying to do this at an affordable price. But these are nonetheless the costs that these things are costing these days. And so this chart shows on the left the cost, and on the right, or on the x-axis, is the size. And so you can see there is this line that shows that as you build it bigger, it gets more expensive, which is kind of intuitive, but it's nice to see that. And the reason that's nice to see is it shows you that even if you're going to build like a smaller ADU, it's not going to cost that much less. So inherently, if you're a rational person, you're going to be interested in spending marginally more money, not 300, but say 350 on average to get an 800 square foot ADU instead of a 550 square foot ADU. And that's just what the data says, is like it's marginally more expensive to build a larger ADU. And in fact, as a result, most of the ADUs that are built up to the upper threshold of 700 to 800 square feet as a statistical matter, because those are going to have a better return on investment. And so, this isn't a lot of data points, obviously, it's only 4, but nonetheless, this does reflect the reality of what I've seen in looking at a lot of data points in previous tours. And unfortunately, it's just pretty expensive to build new construction ADUs. And there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but that's just the reality. I don't like using cost per square foot, but I'm putting it up because I'm going to compare different structural styles here. The reason I do not like to use cost per square foot is because if you build like a 200 square foot ADU, it's going to cost you like $190,000, $225,000, and it's going to look like it's like $2,000 a square foot. It's kind of ridiculous. So I like to use just like fixed costs. And when I talk about cost, I'm talking about the all-in cost. I'm talking about the design, the permitting, the utility upgrades, and the construction costs. All of those things all together. I don't just talk about the construction cost because that's not the cost that you're going to pay. So for example, if you look at Okay, so the average cost for the ADUs that are on the tour tomorrow, $384,000 for the 4 detached ADUs, and their average size is 742 square feet. But, you know, here's an example of the prefab ADU. If I put that into the mix, that's also detached new construction. But as I alluded to, it's kind of the least expensive ADU available right now in the country. And so it wasn't really fair to even put that in the same category as the rest of the custom, design, build ADUs that we're typically seeing in Portland. These are coming in at $300 per square foot. This one cost like $180,000 and it was 600 something square feet. So this is much less expensive than the other ones. Stacked ADUs, like I said, are a little bit more cost efficient than detached new construction standalone ADUs. $427 a square foot. There's 2 of these on the tour, so the data would say that, yep, as you build multiple units in a single structure, it's going to cost a little bit more per square foot. Conversions are going to be quite a bit less expensive. $356 a square foot. The average cost of the 3 that are on the tour are $183,000 for a 513 square foot garage conversion ADU, which is actually, it's good for me because I've been using a lower number, but it's, you know, when you get contemporary numbers each year, the sad news in the line of work that I do is every year it gets more expensive quite a bit. It just goes up steadily. Ever since I've been doing this line of work for the last 15 years, every year it's $10,000 more than it was the previous year to get a job done. So if you stack all these different options up side by side, you can see that new construction for a detached single unit is going to be the most expensive. A stacked ADU is going to be slightly less expensive. Then the garage conversion ADU, and then this Wolf Industries ADU in particular is less expensive than all of those. So that's the bad news. These things are expensive. These are all the costs of all the units that are on the tour tomorrow. And you'll note that there's one outlier up there on the right-hand side. Any guesses as to which one that one might be that costs over $1 million? Cottages, right? So this guy built like 4 units, so it's not really fair to put it on the same chart, is it? Although I did incorporate the stacked ADUs, which have 2 units on the same chart. But I'm guessing those are the 2 that are furthest over to the right beyond the cottage cluster. But let's take that cottage cluster out of the mix, and we see the rest of the ADUs that are being built, and you can kind of start to see more of an accessible range of costs here, starting at a pretty low number, like $40,000 or so, going up to like $500,000 or so. So in this line here, that bold line, that vertical line is the $200,000 mark. And so again, I'm not making these numbers up. This is like real data from homeowners just like you who wanted to build these ADUs for as little as possible. The reality is the only ones that came in less than $200,000 are a tiny house, another tiny house, a garage conversion, another garage conversion, and a prefab unit. Everything else is now over $200,000. There is apparently no way to do a custom new construction ADU for less than that in this market, which is sad. It used to be like pretty possible to do ADUs for less than $150, let alone $200. Now it's essentially impossible to do it for less than $200. And so, things are changing. So as a result, we are seeing people who are on a very limited budget gravitate towards these other options on the left, which is why tiny homes are starting to take hold as an option, why Wolf Industries prefab units are starting to take off as a more common style ADU, and why people who are shopping around for a good deal on which to build an ADU are looking for properties with 2-car garage conversions, 2-car garages to convert, or basements to convert to an ADU. Okay, so there's a lot more to say about cost, and I'm happy to field those as questions, but I don't want try to discuss all of it right now. So just any questions about costs?
Is there still a moratorium on the fees the city charges?
Yeah. So the question was, is there still a moratorium on the system development charges? We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but the answer is yes. Yeah, come on up.
In your experience with the people you talk to, how are most people justifying building a new ADU versus just buying a second home?
That's a great question. I think at this point, it's actually not a foregone conclusion that they should build an ADU rather than buying a second property. It's more of a question. I don't have all the answers to this. There's a lot of things that maybe are beyond my knowledge to get into on this topic. But for one thing, if you buy a second property, let's say you're buying a $400,000 second property, which is a very inexpensive property, but it can be done. Or you're going to build a $400,000 ADU. If you're building a $400,000 ADU, you're going to have to come up with $400,000 of cash. That is really difficult to do. Whereas if you buy a second property, even if you're buying it as an investment property, you only have to come up with 20 or 25% of that. So that's $80,000 or $100,000 most for it. So that's one strong reason why somebody might say, oh, it's much easier to buy a second property. If they want to move into that second property, house hacking, they only have to put 5% down. So 5% would be $20,000 down. So if you only have $20,000 to build an ADU, you can't build an ADU, but you could buy a second property and start renting out your first property. That would be a better strategy if you're limited to $20,000. The other, the properties appreciate, and so maybe you believe that in the future you'll be able to build an ADU on both properties, and so by locking in, you're essentially land banking on that property and hoping that it'll inflate in value, and then you can build on it when you can draw out enough money when interest rates have dropped. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to buy a second property if your aspiration is to speculate for development purposes, for real estate investment purposes, and I wouldn't say that's a bad idea. Conversely, if you're needing a house for granny, then that's not going to be your solution. And so you would need to build an ADU in that case. Or if you see other values in having an ADU on your property that are a mix of different motivations, namely passive rental income potential and multi-generational household flexibility and a whole bunch of other things that might come down the road, ADUs are incredibly flexible tools, whereas another single-family property doesn't afford you that degree of flexibility. It's not really helping the city necessarily, or your community, whereas ADUs are in many ways adding to the housing stock and helping your community. So that might be a motivation for some people.
Okay.
Yeah.
If the overall cost is X to do an ADU, and you talk about the different parts of building an ADU, how would you break it down from a percentage standpoint for design versus upgrading the utilities, utility hookups?
Yeah.
And permitting?
Well, great question. So.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, and so in the future, if everybody wants to ask a question, just go up to the mic so everybody can hear you. So the question was, how do you break down the cost for ADU development by percentage? So I could do that verbally. It's also in the book, and it's in like the longer ADU, like the packet that I give like a breakdown of budgets. And then tomorrow on the tour, a lot of the ADUs will have budget breakdowns, so you actually get to see this directly. But roughly speaking, your permit fees will cost about $10,000. Your for a detached new construction ADU, right? For a garage conversion ADU, and I'm talking about Portland here, might cost $2,000. But we'll just say for new construction, because that's kind of the easiest one, $10,000 for permits. Let's say design could be anywhere from $8,000 to $20,000. Your utility upgrades could be anywhere from $5,000 to $30,000. And then the construction cost would be the remainder, whether it was $200,000 of construction for the least expensive ADU you could do, 300 square feet, let's say custom, to $400,000 for like a nice high-end ADU. And then on top of that, there's other costs that I don't go into. We ask the host not to include on their cost breakdown for the tour tomorrow, namely furnishing and landscaping. Landscaping is not included because it can vary so much from I didn't do anything to my landscape, it's just dirt, you'll see that tomorrow, to like gorgeous landscaping, and that costs a lot of money. If you talk to a landscape designer, they will say allocate 10% of your total project budget to landscaping. They're not wrong. So we're talking for like $300,000 ADU, that's $30,000 of value that you should really theoretically allocate just to landscaping to make that property look good. And you'll see a couple examples of that tomorrow, the difference between nicely done landscaping and not. And it does make a big difference. So anyway, that's a rough breakdown. But I think it varies enough that I think just looking at the actual projects tomorrow and seeing their project breakdown costs will be a more useful way to provide a good answer.
What would be the impact to my property taxes?
What would be the impact on your property taxes? Great question. So for every $100,000 of contributory assessed value that you have added to your property, whether that addition was done through the addition of a deck, or a pool, or an addition, or an accessory building, a garage, or an ADU, it'll be treated the same way by the tax assessor, and that is, they will add roughly $1,400, give or take, for every $100,000 of contributory assessed value of what they deem your property has increased in value. And that's a rough rule of thumb. Multnomah County Office of Taxation and Assessment would hiss at me for giving you such a direct answer. They would make it sound much more complicated. But you are welcome to call them and ask them, and then ultimately you'll come back and say, okay, Cole said it would be this much, because you will not understand what they said. But the way to interpret it is that your construction cost is not equal to the contributory assessed value of the improvement. Just like when you add an ADU to your property, let's say you spent $300,000, it's not going to add $300,000 of resale value. It'll add about 50% of that, maybe $150,000 for the average ADU. Similarly, the Office of Taxation and Assessment would not say that you've added $300,000 of value. They'll say you've added $150,000, maybe $200,000 of value. So if you take your $300,000 ADU and that if you've hired somebody else to do all the work and spent $300,000, then your taxes might increase by what the assessor would say is a contributory assessed value of $200,000. That translates to a $2,800 tax bump for that ADU. Another rule of thumb is think about 1 month's rental income that you could generate from that ADU is equivalent roughly to the amount of taxation increase that you should anticipate seeing from that ADU. I will say a couple other things about this to add some more nuance and color to this conversation because it's really fascinating. If you condoize an ADU, which we'll talk about later, your whole property will be reassessed. So your primary house will be reassessed, the land values will be reassessed, and the ADU will be assessed as well. So it's not just the ADU that's being assessed at its new value, but also the primary house. Whereas right now you might have a really low taxation burden on your primary house because it was locked in 1998 under Measure 5. Now it's going to be bumped up and kicked up to today's taxation rate. Conversely, if you build a tiny house on wheels, it's not taxed as real estate because it's not real estate, it's a personal asset just like your vehicle. So there is no taxation increase on your property for a tiny house on wheels, which is a great loophole. So those are two other interesting things about taxation. And I'll say another interesting thing about taxation is if you build a garage conversion ADU, that garage, let's say you have a garage that's worth $50,000 in the eyes of the assessor, you're deleting that value from your property by eliminating it and putting in an ADU. And you're adding in a modest ADU in its place, so you're subtracting $50,000 of value to your property, you're adding roughly $100,000 of contributory value in the eyes of the assessor. Therefore, that net differential is $50,000. That's going to translate to $700 of tax burden. So garage conversion or basement conversion where you're taking existing valuable non-habitable space and converting it is not only going to be less expensive in the front end, it's also going to cost you less in terms of the tax burden impacts.
if you.
You added a tiny house on wheels, but you had to, make changes to your utilities, and you had to have people come out to assess that. Would they then look at what you're currently paying on your income or your taxes, and then potentially raise those taxes?
Okay, clarify the question. Your taxes would not increase at all.
They wouldn't, even if they had to like change the plumbing.
No. I don't know why, but when you do improvements to your property, it doesn't seem as though trade permits generally increase the value as the assessor. But if you do structural improvements, whether or not, in fact, this is another interesting thing. Let's say you added a deck, okay, to your property. That deck, if that's over like 30 inches in height, you must get permits for that. And that goes through the city, and then that triggers the county to then say, oh, this person, Joanne, added a deck, gotta go out there and reassess that property now because you've added a deck. But if you built a deck less than 30 inches, it doesn't need building permits. And it's totally legal, you can add that deck, but the assessor would never be notified that you had added value to your property, therefore your taxes would not go up until 20 years later, you'd done something that the assessor was like, oh, she added a new addition to your property. They come out and they say, oh, there's an addition and there's a shed that didn't need a permit and a deck, and we're gonna get her for all that money at that point. Tiny house on wheels is not gonna add any tax burden to your property whatsoever though. In terms of the bills, yes, your bills will go up theoretically, marginally, because just like an ADU, it's gonna like tie into your primary main water, electric, gas meters, etc., or not gas, but main water, electric, and sewer, and so your utility bills will theoretically go up by really like $25 a month, maybe $50 a month, very, very nominal increases, yeah.
Are we seeing any on the tour tomorrow that are for sale or have been for sale?
Good question. Yeah, well, the cottage cluster units are all for sale, so there'll be 4 units. Those are like 1,000 square feet, I think, to 1,200 square feet. And then the condo conversion ADUs were for sale, but they are not for sale any longer. And it's not the condo, it's not the ADU, it's the duplex units that were for sale. So in that way, no, we are not seeing any ADUs quote unquote for sale tomorrow. But I will say right now on MLS, on Zillow, if you looked and you knew how to search and filter on MLS correctly, you could find ADUs for sale. They go from a price point of like in this market for like $375 to like $525, I would say, depending on the quality of the ADU and the location of the ADU, just as a point of reference.
For tiny home on wheels as an ADU in Portland, is it still roughly $10K for the building permits, or is it a different permit?
Great question. It is, there's no building permits for a tiny house on wheels. So one of the many benefits of tiny house on wheels, no building permits, same day trade permits. Trade permits cost $200, same day. You could literally like say, I want to put in a tiny house on wheels and have it done with a tiny house in a month. And it would have cost you like $200 in building permits for the electrical, $200 for the electrical permits, and then the actual work, which we'll get into the cost of that in a minute, but it's like $10,000 for the actual work that needs to be done to set yourself up to have the hookups for a tiny house. And a tiny house could be anywhere from $5,000 for a crappy RV to $200,000 for a really sweet tiny house on wheels. But I'd say you can reasonably get a nice new one, a builder grade new one for $60,000 from a company called Vintage Cottages down in Salem, Oregon. Or you could buy a used one for about $50,000, or you could buy a nice new one for about $100,000. But they go up to about $200,000. So huge variation. But go on Craigslist right now on your phone. You will see RVs for sale that have kitchens and bathrooms that cost $5,000, and you can put that in your backyard legally right now. With a $10,000 hookup, so theoretically for $15,000, you could have a unit that wouldn't be taxed that you could live in on your property legally.
So, Cole, pre-pandemic, ADUs were, I wouldn't want to say primarily, but a lot of ADUs were being built to be put initially on Airbnb. Has that changed post-pandemic? Because what I was seeing some of the data was that those people put it on Airbnb and you'd go for 2 or 3 years, in that space before they said, I'm tired, I'm done with this, and then they go rent to their buddy who needs a place to live.
That's Rich's story right there. Rich, raise your hand. Rich is somebody who's doing just that right now. He's changing his ADU from a short-term rental to a long-term rental for that very reason. So certainly there's instances of that. As far as the data goes, I don't know that we have enough data to support that as a broad statement. I will say that for better or worse, ADUs do make really good short-term rentals in the fact that they, not from a marketability perspective, that is true, but from a utility perspective, or sorry, from a utilization perspective, a lot of people have uses for the ADU that is kind of ephemeral in nature. They have parents coming in from out of town, family and friends, they want to use it for workspace, they want to have it for different uses, and that, for that reason alone, short-term rentals are a great match. Unfortunately, for those same people, cities oftentimes do not want more short-term rentals for a variety of good policy reasons. Portland is one of those places where we're like, yeah, you can do an ADU as a short-term rental. We're just not going to help you do it from a financial perspective. Therefore, you have to pay the $20,000 in SDCs, and therefore, a lot more people nowadays are not building ADUs for that reason. But that is directly related to the SDC that we'll talk about more later. But broadly speaking, I think in places where ADUs are allowed to be used as short-term rentals, they are in fact being used disproportionately for that use, at least at the outset, but perhaps over time that changes. I wouldn't be surprised if that's just a thing that will forever change based on market demands and people getting tired of it for a good reason. But some people might say, oh, it's really lucrative and it provides me with flexibility, and maybe that's their primary motivation, and they'll keep it that way forever. So I think it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Let's see. Several years ago, I talked to the permitting office, and they said that we'd have to get buy-in from our neighbors to put a two-story structure in our backyard. Has that changed? I guess.
Is that in Portland?
In Portland, yeah.
Well, it depends. There's a lot of factors there. It doesn't have to do with how many stories, it has to do with how high it is. So if it's 20 feet or less, the midpoint of the gable, that's permissible by right, but you have to respect the 5-foot setback. So if you're not respecting the 5-foot setback, then you must go through what's called conditional type 2 land use adjustment, and you must get permission from your neighbors, which is akin to the process of going through it's not an administrative review, it's a conditional process that takes a lot of upfront work and cost and risk. So maybe that's what you were going through perhaps.
Yeah, we have like an existing structure, like a 2-foot setback. So
yeah, so there's some particularities that we can just talk about offline. Yeah.
You mentioned, I think in the volunteer orientation, about basement units that don't need to be ADUs now but can have ranges. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I have a slide on that later, so we'll talk about that.
Will your presentation talk about the difference between tiny houses and the restriction on accessory short-term rentals between an ADU versus a tiny house?
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. All right, so we'll move on, and that's the section we'll get to now. Is kind of like these different development options that we can now do in Portland, and we'll focus in on a lot of the questions that you guys are asking, which are, this is my wheelhouse and the things that I'm most excited about with what you can do now, so I'm excited that you guys are interested in learning about it. All right, so we're gonna give you some like high-level stuff, and we'll dive into really nitty-gritty stuff. So House Bill 2001 passed in 2019, I believe. It's now in effect in 2020. This says that throughout the state of Oregon, all of Portland metro area, every municipality, suburb of Portland, you can now do middle housing. Middle housing is duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, or fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. Notably, it's not ADUs. ADUs were already passed under separate legislation, so it didn't capture that. And so if you live on a property in Portland, you can now build middle housing for the most part. It also incidentally said that for ADUs, on the second to last line it says, prohibits conditional approval of accessory dwelling unit within urban growth boundary on off-street parking availability or owner occupancy. That is the one line that basically made Oregon's ADU code is statewide and really good. A lot of jurisdictions had owner occupancy prohibitions. Is that if you build it, you have to live on the property. That is the case in most of the country. It sucks. They also, in most cities, say if you build an ADU, you have to build additional off-street parking, whether or not you need it, whether or not you have the space for it, you have to do it. That also sucks. Basically, it kills the potential to build ADUs. So that one line made Oregon have gold standard ADUs essentially statewide. But the broader point here is that you can now do not just ADUs, you can do middle housing on properties in Oregon. And that you have to be subject to reasonable siting and design restrictions. And then if you build middle housing, notably again, not ADUs, I'm not gonna go down this road too much, but you can do what's called a middle housing land division, which means that if you build a duplex, triplex, quadplex, or cottage cluster, you can actually sell off each individual parcel separately. So you can buy a single family house, you can build a detached duplex in your backyard, or a triplex, and you can sell off each unit separately, which is radical, a game-changing concept that basically is doing away with this notion of exclusive single-family zoning. Portland or Oregon was the first state to do that. Now we're seeing that happen in Washington, we're seeing that happen in Nebraska, we're seeing that happen in a lot of other states around the country. One by one, it's kind of taken off in popularity, but Oregon is kind of pioneering in that regard. In terms of the actual new regulatory standards that you think, you won't be able to see all these perhaps from where you're sitting, but I'm just gonna go through this quickly. In terms of, for detached ADUs, the detached ADU has to be 40 feet from the front lot line, 5 feet from the side lot line, 5 feet from the rear. It can be up to 800 square feet, or 75% of the primary dwelling size. So if your primary dwelling is less than, say, if it's 1,000 square feet, your ADU can only be 750 square feet. Basement conversions can be as big as you want now, so you could do like, if you have like a 1,200 square foot basement, you can convert the whole thing to an ADU, that's permissible. If you're gonna do 2 ADUs on a property, one of the 3 units on your property must be visitable. That is a standard on the gradient of accessibility. The city wants more accessible housing, so they're saying you have to be able to get into one of the 3 units without going up any steps, without having to, you should be able to roll into your bathroom and roll into the shower. You should be able to have walkways or doorways that are 31 3/4 inches wide. It's actually not that hard to make an ADU visitable, and there's exceptions if you're on a steep lot. We don't need to go into that in too much depth. It's only if you're building 2 ADUs. The building lot coverage, don't even sweat that one, except that if you're building a stacked ADU, let's just disregard this one. It never comes up in practice, so I'm not going to really worry about it. We can talk about it if we want. The midpoint of the gable has to be 20 feet higher or less, and they're measuring that from the lowest point of grade. So whereas they used to measure from the highest point of grade, now they're measuring from the lowest point of grade, which means, in effect, if you're building on a slope, if you're on a slope plot, it's more difficult now to build a 2-story ADU as a result of that code change. So if you happen to have a slope plot, this is disadvantageous to you. Most people are building ADUs on the east side of Portland. Most of East Portland is flat. This isn't an issue most of the time, but once in a while it is. The exterior finished materials have to match the primary house or have any of these design standards that are very easy to hit. 612 roof pitch, which is 6 feet of rise or 12 feet of run. So that's a 12 roof pitch. This is a 612 roof pitch. Anything that's this steep or steeper is permissible. Trim has to be 3.5 inches wide or greater. Siding reveal has to be 6 inches tall or less. Eaves have to be 1 feet on all sides or greater. Windows have to be vertical, not horizontal. Stupid rule. Notably, there's no off-street parking requirements anymore for any residential properties in Portland, including ADUs. You do not have to provide off-street parking for ADUs. Heck, you could eliminate your off-street parking when you're building an ADU if you wish to do so. Just note that if you do eliminate your off-street parking, you actually have to enclose the curb cut, and that can cost you a few $1,000s. So it's not a non-cost. And in many cases, like having an off-street parking spot is desirable. So it's not that you should get rid of it just because you can. But if you don't want to have it, you don't have to anymore. Okay, you can also do a number of other things under the residential infill project, including 2 ADUs, triplexes, duplexes, can have ADUs, 4plexes. And because of all the allowances that city of Portland now has, you can actually look at the data from 2021 to 2022, and they found that out of, it used to be prior to residential infill project, that the dominant form of housing in Portland in residential zones was single-family residential. We would see the big McMansions going up. This is what caused the city to focus on this issue under the residential infill project, which took 5 years to pass, but ultimately they did pass it. And as the year after it passed, the data showed that only 16% of all of the housing units being permitted in the residential zone were single-family units. All the rest were fourplexes and ADUs. So it had dramatic impact on the style of housing production that we were seeing in the residential zone. So it was a resounding success in terms of getting new construction to be more attainable, smaller units, which was the policy goal behind the residential infill project. Because we have an over-dominant stock of single-family homes in the city as it stands currently. Okay, so one of the questions that was just posed was about this interesting provision that was passed by the Building Codes Division in the City of Portland in 2020, where the Building Codes Division is different from the Planning and Zoning Department. The Building Codes Division said one day, hey, you know what, we're going to allow you to add accessory kitchens in your single-family house. And the Planning and Zoning Department said, what? Like, you're going to do, what did you just say that people can do? And the Building Department was like, yeah, you can add as many kitchens as you want to a single-family house. So you can now do that in Portland without calling it an ADU. This was like shocking, interesting, weird. And at first I was kind of a little bit frustrated because it seemed to be running counter to this notion that we want people to build ADUs. But then as I started to do more and more consultations on properties, I realized this is a really useful provision. What they're saying is basically in your basement or anywhere else in your house, if you want to add a full kitchen now, not just a sink, you can get a full kitchen. That is to say, a kitchen is generally defined by specifically a sink and a stove. You cannot put in a sink or a stove without it being a kitchen. Generally speaking, you cannot add a second kitchen to a property without calling it a housing unit or an ADU. But this provision says, no, we're going to let you put in as many kitchens as you want in a single-family house. And this becomes really useful if your primary motivation is you have a basement, you want to finish your basement, you want to rent it out as a short-term rental, you don't want to put it on, you don't want to pay the system development charges, which you would otherwise have to pay if you're building a housing unit. But you're not building a housing unit, you're just doing an addition, and that addition happens to have a kitchen, which is now permissible. The drawback of this provision is that you cannot separate that addition of your house from the rest of the house. So it has to be not obstructed by a wall or a door, in theory. But you know and I know, putting on a door on a hinge is very quick and very easy. So after you got your certificate of occupancy, nobody's going to know if you put up a door between one portion of the house and another. But officially, you're not supposed to have that door there. So if you were to go to transact on that property, that door would have to disappear. If you're going to have another building inspection, the door would want to disappear. If the house is getting appraised, you should probably make that door disappear. But otherwise, you can have the door there, nobody's going to know the difference. And you can have your cake and eat it too. And guess what? If it's not an ADU, for an ADU, you have to have separate utility connection. You have to have separate electrical panel, separate heat system, separate water heater, separate entrance. With this provision, you can have one single water heater, one single electrical panel, one single heat system. So imagine like the general utility policy for ADUs is thou shalt not have to move from unit A through unit B in order to access your utilities for unit A. So I can't have, if you imagine your single family house and you have your heat system in the basement with like the loud furnace, you can't have that if you're converting that to a basement. It has to be relocated somewhere in your basement. You can access it without going through unit B. You have to eliminate it, convert to ductless mini split, move it somewhere else in your basement. But in this provision now, you can just simply wall it off, put sound insulation around it, finish up the rest of your basement, and then you can walk right through that portion of your single family house and still call it a single-family house, and now you can have a kitchen in it, and you can do a short-term rental in it if you want, because it's not an ADU, and so you're not charged the system development charges, and that's permissible. And then the city went further than that. They said now in accessory structures detached from your primary house, you can also now add sinks. So you can add multiple sinks. You can add a kitchen sink, that's fine. You cannot have a stove, however. But guess what? We don't need stoves anymore. We live in a place where you can use a microwave, or you can use a convection oven, you can use a toaster oven, you can use a hot plate. There's a lot of ways to heat up food without having a permanent hardwired connection. So it's pretty easy now to build a detached accessory structure or an internal thing that has all the functionality of an ADU without calling it an ADU. For better or worse, that is now the world that we live in, at least in Portland, that there's all these things that you can do that are very close to being ADUs, and there's a reason you might want to not call it an ADU, specifically the short-term rental matter, but there might be other provisions as well. From my vantage, it doesn't hurt anything. You're still adding more housing units, whether or not the city can officially count it as a housing unit in their housing elements. It is, still providing you the flexibility that you might wish to have. It's still providing you with the rental income you might wish to have. So this is a new suite of options that is providing more flexibility. So although I'm a little bit frustrated at the discordance between the planning and zoning policy impetus for more ADUs and the liberal attitude that the Building Codes Division has, it nonetheless is playing out to be a pretty important little loophole that the city has now enabled us to do on our property. Cottage cluster. So this is an example of the cottage cluster. These are not ADUs. They can be up to actually 1,800 square feet, 2 stories, 900 square foot footprints. This is an example of like a 7,000 square foot lot with 4 units on it. I should say, like, when I put together the ADU tour, I am not trying to look, this is not the AIA architectural tour. Like, this is the tour of the people. This is what people are building. I don't, like, put parameters on design like other tours might have. I'm, like, trying to showcase what you can do with the property. So that's kind of my policy goal. This is an example of that. I'm not saying this is a gorgeous example necessarily, but some people might really like it. I don't know. But this is a really good example of a cottage cluster. This is right in the Alberta Arts District. And these are going to be all for sale. These are pretty compact units, but they're detached. And the developers, to their credit, are putting a lot of money on the line to go into this experiment of building this new housing type that didn't previously exist. And these are going to be for sale. I don't know how much they are. Probably guessing in the $500,000 price range. And these are going to be sold as condos. So this is an example of that. And we're going to see more and more larger parcels, like anywhere from 7,000 to like 20,000 square feet parcels, being scooped up by developers and housing detached units being put in on them. The cottage cluster provisions require that each and every new structure you add has to be detached from one another. They cannot be attached. And they have to be 1,800 square feet or less. It's pretty simple. Beyond that, it's really flexible in terms of the codes that the state has for them. And this is a state mandate that you have to do this now. So this is true throughout all of the, like every developed city in Oregon, essentially. Okay, tiny house on wheels. So this is a provision that went into effect in 2021. This provision states that you can now have an RV on your property, and it can be dwelled in. And tiny house on wheels is a colloquial term that I'm using because it is a subset of the broader term RV. RV is basically anything on wheels. There's no certification requirements for RVs under this standard. This means that you can buy an RV that's used on Craigslist right now and put on your property. It doesn't have to be past any inspections. Nobody has to look at it from the city. And you can use that as a housing unit. The codes associated with this are that if you have, you can have as many RVs on as you want on your property, you always could. You can only have one inhabitant though. can't have more than one inhabitant under this rule. If you have one that has a kitchen or bathroom, which you should, if you're going to do this, then you must have a sewer connection. You cannot have a composting toilet, you cannot have an incinerating toilet, you can't have a composting toilet. It has to be connected to the sewer. That's just like an ADU. It has to have a dedicated electrical circuit, which is going to be most commonly 50 amps, sometimes a 30 amp circuit. And then it has to have a water connection, which is like literally a hose from your hose bit from the outside of the house. So the average situation, so I started the company with my colleague, who's going to be at one of the other tiny house site tomorrow. We started a company called Tiny Hookups, where we serve as general contractors to put in the infrastructure for you on your behalf. We start off with a consultation, charge $100, and then teach you how you do it yourself. We've done it about 20 times now for people. And I wouldn't say it's actually all as easy as I thought to do this work. It's surprisingly complicated. But in any case, we'll do that first $100 consultation, and then if you want us to do the work for you, like any other general contractor, we manage the project, we hire an electrician, a plumber, and we add 20% to whatever charge they have to do the work. We coordinate it all, and we get it all done, and it takes 2 weeks, and it usually comes out to about $10,000. It can range from 5,000 on the low end to like 60,000 on the high end, but almost always it's like $10,000 to $20,000 for most properties. And the nuances of this are, let's say, okay, so you have to have a dedicated electrical circuit. And most tiny houses take 50 amps. If you have an RV, most RVs take 30 amps. You could literally run an extension cord from an RV outlet, which would be akin to what you have on your dryer. If you have a washer dryer, your dryer outlet would work for a 30 amp electrical connection if you could run an extension cord from that to your tiny house. But generally, people would prefer to have a dedicated outlet outside next to their RV parking pad. The RV has to be, it's supposed to be behind the front architectural facade of the primary house. It may not be in front of the primary house. There's no setback requirements for these. There's no permits for the RV. There's just permits for the infrastructure. And you don't have to use it. So you can put in the infrastructure and then choose to rent it out or not. The market rate for a rental parking pad is about, I'd say, $400 on the lowest end to about $800 on the highest end. I'd say $500 to $600 a month is the going rate. Alternatively, you can put in your own house, tiny house on wheels on that spot, and charge probably $1,000 on the low end to like $1,300 on the high end in Portland. So this is a really good return on investment, and a lot of people are using this, like I said, culturally as like the new ADU, and you'll see a good example of that. I'm using one, which is where the registration site is tomorrow, as a rental unit. And the other property is like a multi-generational household living together in their tiny house. Gorgeous tiny house, probably $150,000 or so, built by a company named Treeform Tiny down in Eugene, I think. So they're all in cost like, I don't know, $170, $180 for this development, and we did the hookups for them. So you can learn about the hookups tomorrow, you can learn about the tiny homes tomorrow. So that is another option, and I'm happy to talk more details about that if there's questions. But this is the woman who's living in the tiny house. She's 81 years old now. This is an example of a tiny house that's on Craigslist for $72,000. This is an example of an RV that's on Craigslist for $10,000 with a full kitchen. So just to show you, I wouldn't want to live in that. I wouldn't want to have that on property, but you could legally now have that on your property. Most people are putting in tiny homes, but you could put that in on the property. We're the only city in the country that is now allowing that. Now, I did want to mention, as a moment of advocacy, if I could have Kelsey, could you take a quick video? Can you come up here, take a quick video while I do this? I'll give you my phone. I'm not gonna go into this in too much detail, but I just wanted to allude to the fact that, let me just take a video of the audience if you don't mind. Okay, so I just wanted to allude to the fact that there is now this opportunity to have a tiny house on wheels or an RV on your property, and it might be coming to another Oregon city near you, maybe. So, for Portlanders, raise your hand if you support this housing option for your city. They basically ask you, do you support this idea or do you not support this idea? I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you support this idea that it's okay to have a tiny house on wheels on your property and live in it. Okay, and lower your hand, raise your hand if you live in Portland and you don't think this is a great idea to be able to do this. Okay. And for those who are not in Portland, we'll just say I know there's not a lot of people in the Portland metro areas, but let's just say if you're not in Portland, no, I'm sorry, actually, this is not a raise your hand exercise. This is just, please send me an email if you live outside of Portland and you live in Oregon and you're interested in having this opportunity on your property. Because right now, we are the only city that allows this in the country, and definitely in Oregon. And there's a potential for this to pass as a statewide matter. So, that's it. Okay, stacked ADUs. This is something I've talked about already, but this is a new provision. There's two great examples of this. One is still they're both under construction, to be honest, but the one down in Woodstock is a little bit further along. It's got some incredible finishes. Condomization. This is an emerging topic that is becoming more and more popular, especially in Seattle and in Austin, Texas, which are two other big ADU hubs in the country. We're seeing a lot of ADUs being condoized. Condoization is a legal apparatus, legal process that you do in conjunction with the state, not with the city. The city doesn't know about whether or not you've condoized your property. What condoization allows you to do is sell off a portion of your property. That portion of your property could be a driveway, it could be a shed, it could be the top floor, it could be your attic, it could be a bedroom. In practice, what we see are condoized units, housing units, whether in this case on the upper left, it's detached cottages that are being condoized, and the lower right, it's the duplex units and the ADU that are being condoized. Why might somebody want to condoize a project? Well, ADUs aren't something you can sell independent of the house, typically. If you have a $500,000 house and you have a $300,000 ADU, like I said previously, your property will be worth roughly $650,000. Whereas if you condoize it, that primary house might take a haircut. It might be worth not $500,000, but maybe $400,000, $450,000 because you've lost the backyard. Meanwhile, that ADU that you built for $300,000 might be, you might be able to sell it for $400,000, $500,000. So net, you'd be silly not to condoize the property if your goal was to resell that property after you were said and done. So it's kind of like this concept that really hasn't gone on in a big way, except amongst developers in Portland. The developers at the cottage cluster have done a number of properties with 2 detached ADUs that they've condoized, so they're very experienced with that if you want to talk to people about that. They have done that, now they're doing cottage clusters. And the property on the lower right, that's more of like a family compound style ADU where you had a house hack basically to be able to afford buying this pretty expensive property and build this compound. Condoization is definitely an interesting new kind of concept that's being applied in the residential zones now that we have these a variety of new housing types beyond just single family homes to work with. We have middle housing and ADUs, and you can condoize any of them. And the prospect of being able to sell them independently is very appealing. The downside, as I alluded to earlier, is your taxes will increase most likely in most cases. The other downside is it costs $20,000 and takes about 6 months of work with a lawyer to go through the condoization process. You must use an attorney essentially, and you have to go through this very bureaucratic process with the state and the county, but it's a by right thing. So happy to field questions about this as we get to the next Q&A section. I'll go through a few more slides, then we'll take Q&As, and I hope there's a lot of good questions that are generated here. And I would recommend maybe people stand up in line to get in queue if you want to ask questions. Okay, so, or not, we're not, it's fine. ADUs with additional space. So not only can you build,
I have a question.
Yeah.
So going back to the tiny home, the change of the laws on tiny homes, do you have to own the tiny home to park it in your property, or can someone else that owns a tiny home park it in your property? You sort of lease them the right to park there? And then does it necessarily have to need hookups, or can it just be parked without hookups?
Yeah, great question. So, no, you don't have to own it. Incredibly flexible. So you can own the property, own the tiny house. You can own the property, rent out the space to somebody else with tiny house. You can own the property and rent out the space to somebody else who doesn't have a tiny house but is leasing it from a third party, bring it to your property. I mean, this is like incredibly Wild West territory here in terms of entrepreneurial opportunities. What was the second part of your question? Oh yeah, it doesn't have to have hookup. If you have plumbing inside the tiny house, then you must have a sewer and water connection. No matter what, you have to have a dedicated electrical circuit. So that's it. And like I said, the trade permits for that cost about $200 for plumbing, $200 for electric, and the work can cost anywhere from, you know, a couple $1,000s to $15,000 if you have a decent set of existing utilities to your primary house. I'll just rattle off those three things to look for in your primary house. You essentially have to have a 200 amp service serving your primary house to do this, otherwise you'll have to upgrade your electrical service, which costs like $5,000. You have to have PEX or copper water line serving your lateral, serving your primary house, or else you'll have to upgrade from your galvanized plumbing, because a plumber won't add new water fixtures without upgrading. And then sewer is the most complicated of the three. You have to have sufficient slope to extend your sewer to wherever you want to have your tiny house, and this will be the same for an ADU, which just means you might have to do a trench. If you have a basement, you'll be able to access your sewer without too much difficulty. But if you have a house on a perimeter foundation without a basement, most likely then you're going to have to run a trench all the way out to toward the street to tie into the sewer to have enough depth such that you can have gravitational flow to drain from the tiny house. So that can cost a little bit more money because of the extra trenching costs.
Another tiny house question. So if you were to build a deck onto it that's 30 inches or less, right? So you don't have to work out the permits. Do you ever like take it off the wheels or put it on blocks or something? Or does it have to be on wheels? Is that what makes it?
Yeah, actually, you do have to keep it on wheels, but the wheels don't have to touch the ground. And so we do the hookups for properties, like we do the infrastructure and then we do the actual final blocking and leveling, which we call you lift the tiny house off the ground. We put it on 4 load-bearing cribbing posts, like essentially like cinder blocks with little shims. We have a system that we like that works really well. And that costs like, $200 in materials and like 6 hours of labor, something like that. And then we also do the final plumbing connection to the existing cleanout from the tiny house. What was the second part of your question? Or did I get it?
You got it, but I have another question too.
Okay.
Would solar panels on the top of the tiny house cover the amperage that you need?
I don't think so. Off-grid tiny houses are definitely a thing, but we haven't seen that yet in Portland as like a way that tiny houses are being done. There's a lot of utilization, a lot of use and application for off-grid tiny houses with the complex solar panels. But in this application, you have to have a dedicated electrical circuit by code. So all the tiny houses are using all electric. We recommend going all electric. Oh yeah, I know the other thing I was going to mention. We recommend going all electric, no propane, no gas, just because it's a safety matter. And 50 amps will get you everything you need. The other thing I was going to mention is when I made reference to a parking pad, you do not need a parking pad either. Initially, when we were doing this work, we were putting in gravel parking pads. You don't need them. These things can literally just be parked on grass. They can be underneath a tree. Normally, you can't build an ADU underneath a tree because there's a tree root protection zone. In this case, because it's not a structure, you're not damaging the tree roots. You can put it right underneath the tree. There's all these kind of subtle but meaningful advantages to tiny houses like that are pretty nifty. So there are some applications where having a compacted gravel pad is preferable, but it's not necessary. We just do it on grass with a really robust locking and bubbling system, and it works just fine.
For the sink example that you gave, where you can build like an accessory dwelling with a sink and just not have a stove, how many of those can you have on your, like how many of those structures could you add on your property?
Infinite. Yeah. Yeah, there's no, you can only have two permanent ADUs, but you could have infinite structures without full kitchens in them. So everything other than the stove at this point, you do infinite. There are some provisions. If it's a structure, you have to have respect to 5-foot setback unless it's under a certain size. If it's, you have to have a certain amount of lock, there's a lot coverage limitation. Like all the structures on your lot can exceed no greater than 60% of the lot coverage, I believe. Each individual structure can be no greater than 900 square feet. But with all those exceptions in mind, or with those standards in mind, like anything goes. And so I talked about, let's see, in this case, we have ADUs that have additional habitable space. So this is an example. You'll see this on ADU number 5, an ADU above a garage. It's a 500 square foot ADU above a 500 square foot garage. So you could do a 500 square foot ADU above a 900 square foot garage. That's totally acceptable. In the lower case, you have an 800 square foot ADU, and then it has a bump out shed fastened to the house, attached to the house, that has storage units for 2 of the 3 units on the property. It's a really creative application of additional 200 square feet. So it's essentially like a 1,000 square foot structure, 200 square feet of which is not part of the quote-unquote ADU, but it's accessible from the outside of the ADU, not part of the interior habitable space of the ADU. It's firewall separated from the ADU, and therefore it's totally acceptable. And you can do that, or you can build a workshop, or you can do an ADU with firewall separation, then a detached accessory structure such as an office or a garage or a studio space or any number of things associated with this. So there's a lot of options at your disposal. Now, the limitations are lot size and cash. All this stuff costs a lot of money. So this is a prefab unit number 7. This is the Wolf Industries ADU. Looks perfectly nice on the inside, right? Like perfectly nice. Got a pitched roof, and this guy's pretty psyched about it. So talk to him. He's the homeowner. Structural conversions. There's 3 examples of structural conversions on the tour tomorrow, all of which happen to be garages. Notice that they're all like larger than average. These are not one car garages. These are 2-car garage conversions or 1.5-car garage conversions. The upper left-hand one, I believe, is 1.5 cars. And the right one and the lower one, I believe, are 2-car garage conversions. I generally recommend 2-car garage conversions over a 1-car garage conversion because a 1-car garage conversion is like 220 square feet. It's just not quite big enough for a typical ADU. It's not worth it in terms of the cost. 2-car garage conversions are worth it in terms of the cost. And as we saw from the data, like the average all-in cost for these garage conversions is about $180 these days. So certainly a lot less expensive than new construction. The reason that is because you have an existing foundation, you have existing walls, you have existing roof, existing siding. So that structural shell in and of itself is like half the cost of construction. The other half of the cost of construction is all the interior work that you need to do. All the appliances, the flooring, the walls, the insulation, the windows, all this stuff costs about 50% of the total project cost. That is why accessory structure or conversions of existing structures that are permitted are less expensive. If they are not permitted, if you have an unpermitted structure, you're not going to be able to convert that to an ADU. But if it's a permitted garage, then you have the right to convert to an ADU. A builder might walk into that structure and say, no, I am not touching that thing. I do not like to do garage conversions. Or they might say, this thing is falling over. that has a bad foundation, it's got mold, it's got rot, it's got mildew. But if you have a two-car garage conversion that's dry, the wood is dry, it doesn't smell musty, moldy, rotty, the roof is in good condition, that's a potentially really good thing to consider converting if you're trying to build an affordable ADU. If you're not otherwise using your garage, most people aren't using garages for cars anymore, but oftentimes they're heavily used for storage. Bear in mind that if you're doing a garage conversion, not only are you deleting this non-habitable storage space you have in your property, but you're also adding a second household to your property. And they're going to want their storage for their stuff, their bikes, their canoes, their trash cans, their lawnmowers. So you do want to account for that. So oftentimes when people do garage conversions, they end up having to add another shed to accommodate all the storage needs on the property. Similarly, same thing goes for basement conversions. You might have to add more storage space. But all things considered, like absolutely, if you're looking for like a good deal to get a property where you can do a low-cost ADU, garage conversions are a good option in that case. You are allowed to convert them by right if they're permitted. It doesn't mean that they're going to be good structures for conversion. So definitely do a consultation with me or with a builder if you're considering a particular property. You want to convert it to an ADU because not every structure can work. You cannot go most two-car